Okay, co-opers, I am Sam McAfee, and I'm going to be walking you through designing and validating your solution. And we're going to do it in this talk the way that the startups that I work with are doing it. Because we may be co-ops, but we're also trying to build viable businesses that have to be successful and profitable in a marketplace. So, many of those startups are using what we call the business model canvas. You may have been exposed to this model. You might even be using it. Maybe you've made a canvas. That's a quick and easy way to figure out all of the assumptions that go into your business model, from the customer segments to the value proposition, the cost and revenue structures. But the key thing here is that they are all assumptions. And as assumptions go, many of them will be wrong. And it's up to us to figure out which ones are wrong and adjust that so that we can continue building our business, right? And so something on the canvas is wrong, but we don't know what it is. And testing your solutions is a way of figuring it out, right? So the one thing I want to really get across that I hope you all internalize is I want you to start thinking about all of the tasks that you're doing in your business as experiments. You're in a constant state of continuous improvement, always tinkering, and always trying to collect data about what is next, right? And so what we want to think about for this little talk here is a good experiment has really three parts to it, right? You want to state your hypothesis really clearly, have a clear stated hypothesis, have clear validation criteria, so we know how we're going to test our hypothesis and what we're going to use to build the experiment, and then have a quantitative threshold that is irrefutable ahead of time. So humans are really good at convincing themselves that they knew something after the fact, and so we want to try to avoid that bias by making sure we set out the threshold for our experiments ahead of time. And so I would love it if, as you're building your businesses, you think of it as a to-do list of experiments that need to be verified so that you can check off all the assumptions on that business model canvas over time and actually successfully grow. So what do I mean by an example experiment? Here's one around testing a value proposition on a landing page, right? So in this case, I've got a hypothesis. We believe that the value proposition will be compelling enough when we show it to people that users will want to sign up for more information, right? So this is a particular kind of experiment. We'll talk about a few different types in a minute. This would be a landing page experiment, and we know that we're testing the value proposition. That's the focal point of the experiment, right? We know that we're testing that value proposition through a landing page, which means that users on the internet will be sent to a page where the value proposition will be displayed, and possibly in words and images. And the idea is we're testing user behavior. Is that value proposition compelling enough that people sign up? And then we set a very clear quantitative threshold of this experiment is only successful if, say, 15% of users sign up. And we're going to collect at least 200 visits to run that 15% threshold on so that we can be sure that it's, statistically valid, let's say, right? So every experiment should have these components. We should have a hypothesis that we can state clearly. What are we testing? How will we know when it has been successful? And exactly what metric are we using to measure that, right? So let's talk about progress in your company, in your co-op, right? And so each of them is going to be providing some kind of value to some kind of customer. And so this is a little model here I learned from some colleagues about how to think about the metrics that you would be measuring for the customer journey, right? So that means each customer, when they encounter your good or service or product, is going to be coming through this model. First, you're going to acquire them through some kind of marketing channels, right? And when they arrive, they're going to be curious about whether this solution solves their problem, right? Like, they will have the problem, they'll have seen maybe the value prop on a landing page, click through and come to check out your product or service. They will activate, they'll try it out, they'll do the free trial, they'll subscribe, whatever it is, possibly put some money in. and they'll give it a whirl, and that's where the activation happens. And if they like it, if it actually does solve their problem, they will continue to use the product. And that's where you see this retention loop here, right? Customers being retained. And if all of that is working properly, some revenue will possibly be generated, right? Depending on where you are in your life cycle. And also, if they're excited enough about the product to tell all their friends about it, which means it's really solving the problem in a very delightful and wonderful way, they will start referring people. So you'll start to acquire new customers through a referral loop that is basically free marketing, right? Because the customers are selling it to each other. So that's the customer journey set of metrics. So when we're doing experiments, what we would want to be doing is running experiments on particular metrics in this model to see which ones, which part are we trying to validate it's going to apply to this set, right? So there's another way of thinking about measuring your progress, which is more the company lifestyle, right? Like the stages of growth that people are going through as they build their co-ops or as they build their businesses, right? And so these three phases we're typically going through in a linear order as we reduce the uncertainty around our new idea. The first one that most startups spend a lot of time in is, have we discovered a problem that's actually worth solving? That's when we're in our empathy phase. This refers specifically to empathy with the customer or the user. Do we have a problem that we've identified in the market that's actually worth paying for a solution to solve? We won't know until we go out and do our problem statement interviews and that sort of thing. And I believe that's being covered in another talk. Next, we've got the stickiness phase. So we start to put a solution in front of people. The big question is our solution sticky? In other words, are customers coming back? That refers to that retention model we just looked at, right? So this retention bump in the middle, that's the stickiness part. Does your solution solve it sufficiently enough that customers come back and continue to use it? Are they satisfied? And then finally, are customers so excited, that's the referral loop at the bottom, that the solution is great and they're telling everybody, and that's when we're in the growth phase. So these are phases that a company goes through. First, trying to figure out if there's a problem being solved that's worth money to people. Then, are we actually solving it properly? And then, are people raving about it and sending us their friends and colleagues to try it as well, right? So most of this talk is going to be on the stickiness phase. And let's look at these metrics again for the customer journey. So when we superimpose these two on top of each other, you can see that when we're in the empathy phase, most of the experiments that we're running are going to be around acquisition and activation, right? Like, can we find the right target customer segment? Do they have the problem that we think they have? Can we put a value proposition in front of them that proposes to solve that problem that'll be attractive enough for them to try the product? Once we've moved into the stickiness phase, then we are actually seeing if they will continue using the product because it does in fact solve the problem. And then only finally at the end, once we've got this flywheel going, are we solving the problem effectively enough that we're in the growth phase? So that's how those two metrics frameworks kind of fit together, if that makes sense. So let's talk about types of experiments, right? So I've divided the types of experiments into four main phases: voice, pictures, prototypes, and the minimal viable product. And what I want to show you on this graph is the idea of risk versus the cost of doing an experiment, right? So what this model is supposed to show you is that in the beginning of your project or company, and this x-axis should be labeled as time, so over time. So on the left, we're in the beginning, and the risk around the company is really high. There are a lot of some assumptions that we have that haven't been validated. And so over time, as we engage in experiments, we slowly reduce that risk because we're gathering data about the market and our ability to serve that market, right? So in the first phase, these are basically organized in terms of the cost of doing these experiments, right? So in the first phase, we're just using our voice to run experiments. Those might be customer interviews or pitches or any kind of conversational type of experiment, because that's the cheapest one, right? Like, it doesn't really cost anything other than time to schedule interviews with people and talk to them and explore the product that way. And as you go through time and collect more and more data, not only are you reducing risk, but you're earning permission to then do slightly more expensive and costly experiments that gather more data about the business model, right? And I'm going to go through all 4 of these phases right now. So again, in the first phase, we're talking about voice, right? So you would probably go through this process as you're exploring the pain points and problems with customers as well. But I think there's definitely a strong case to be made for using your voice to start testing the solution as well, right? So that's pitching the solution to customers before you've built anything. Now, I know that a lot of you already have built something, but let's just say that if you were at the beginning, you could go and say, I understand you have this pain point. I want to give you a description of a possible solution. You tell me how compelling it sounds, right? Because you can just talk to people very, very easily, right? This is the cheapest to execute. There's no materials required. You can do it over Zoom. It's COVID safe, right? And so what you're doing is you're getting people's reactions in real time to the value proposition. And as you recall from the business model canvas, the value proposition is one of the things that you're testing on the canvas, right? So you can test the value proposition through interviewing people, right? And if your solution is compelling enough, you can even see if people want to put some money down to get early access to the solution before it's even ready yet. That happens all the time. It's not that unusual. People, if they have a compelling enough pain point and your solution sounds like it'll do the trick, they might just take out their wallet and write a check for a deposit to get in on the goods early on. So it's totally something that you can do when you're testing the solution, right? Second phase is pictures, right? So this is all of those kind of paper prototypes, clickable mock-ups. They aren't actually the product, but it's a representation of what the product might look like, right? So you can make mock-ups with paper or online tools. It's usually pretty fast and lightweight to do. Yes, you can sketch. You don't have to be a designer or an artist to be able to do sketches. There's lots of easy videos on YouTube where you can see how to do basic prototype sketching. It's not that hard or scary. And what it does is it allows you to take the customer or user through a model of what the product will actually look like and gauge their response to the experience. If you're not making a piece of software, if it's more of a real world product, you can do it with storyboarding, right? Like you can draw storylines and show the user what the customer experience that they're expected to have will look like on paper or in a model or in a presentation or a slideshow. This whole phase is about illustrating what the experience is going to be like of the solution, again, before you've really invested too much time into actually building something, and see if you can get user feedback on how the experience seems like it's going to feel. What are their expectations? What are their fears? That sort of thing, right? And again, you can iterate on a number of these very, very quickly because we're still at the low end of the cost curve. Now, in stage 3, we're starting to actually make things, right? So this is the prototyping phase. And the thing that I want you to think about in terms of prototyping is that it's mostly around the user experience. It doesn't have to be the full platform. It doesn't have to be the full business model. You want to basically put something in their hands or put them in front of an experience that actually takes them through the real thing, right? So if you're building some sort of device, they do this a lot sort of at the D school, and IDEO always teaches this method of making like cardboard versions of an object before you go and have it actually built at a manufacturing plant, right? So you can sort of get a sense of the form factors of a product. If it's a physical product, you can do prototyping with software very easily. You can prototype service businesses through existing online tools, handling things over email or using Calendly or Trello or other tools that exist. And basically, you're trying to deliver the value to the user without having to build the whole back office back end behind it, right? So it's really just testing the experience of interacting with the product or service. It does not need to scale. It doesn't have to be something that you keep for a long time. It just needs to validate assumptions about how it's going to feel to actually solve the problem with a real thing. So it does need to work. And then finally, we've got the minimal viable product, which is an overused and confusing term, but where I mean it here is it's the absolute minimal version of the fully working product that you can put in front of a customer that will actually deliver the value and will orchestrate the whole system. So if it's a multi-stakeholder, multi-sided marketplace with supply and demand, you would have a system together that serves the suppliers so that they can make their supply available, and also makes that supply available to people who will want to buy it, and you can actually execute the transaction, and that would have to actually work, even if it's not the final version, right? So it doesn't have to be perfect. It doesn't need to scale. You don't have to keep it, but it should give you some idea of the unit economics of the business model. Hopefully that makes some sense. So what I want to see from you folks when we interact is, are you looking at your whole business model in terms of a series of experiments and walking through things very methodically, that each week that you're working on your business, you have a clear sense of what your hypothesis is that you're testing, how are you collecting data to test it, and what are your clear thresholds that you're going to know whether this solution is actually solving the problem that it's supposed to solve. So I'm looking forward to our session, and I will talk to you all soon.